Welcome to Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast. Join the podcast mogul Phil Better as he interviews successful entrepreneurs that make their living in the digital world. Now, let's join your host, Phil Better, and his special guest today on Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast. I am, of course, your host with the most, Phil Better. And today I'm very excited to talk about our guest, who is the co-founder and executive chairman of Prodify. He is convinced that a product is the single most important success driver for a tech company, which is why he founded Prodify, to share what he learned from being an advisor to over 50 tech companies and to continue to help others realize their full potential. Our guest has led successful technology products for the last 25 years. He cut his teeth at eBay during its heyday, then moved to product leadership roles at OPower, GoCanvas, and most recently as CPO of Whoop. He has been featured on several product podcasts, spoken at top product events, lectured at HBS, and co-authored the book, Build What Matters. Please welcome our guest, Ben Foster. Ben, thank you for coming on the show today.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Ben, I gave you a very nice little intro there, highlighting some key moments of your success, but I would love for you just to give us a quick introduction in your own words.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. You know, I've been involved in the whole ecosystem of technology and Silicon Valley and things like that for really the entirety of my career. You know, I had the great fortune of getting started back in 1998, I guess. So it was kind of like this perfect moment in Silicon Valley where, you know, everything was kind of like taking off up and to the right. And that was all before the big .com crash, you know. So during that couple of years window, I just had all these amazing opportunities thrown at me to learn so much because nobody really had experience with the internet. Nobody had experience with a lot of these, you know, kind of like technology products, et cetera. And so, you know, I felt like I had this amazing just chance to get to learn so much so fast. And I was given so much more responsibility than I think anybody would ever justify giving to somebody at that age, you know, now. And I guess kind of, you know, based on that, I just learned and I tried to apply the kinds of things that I learned. You know, you learn from a lot of mistakes, you learn from your successes as well. And I had the good fortune of having some great mentors, and it really kind of took me down the path of really getting very excited and very deeply invested in the kind of like product and technology community. I've stayed very involved in that because I really just love it. You know, it's something that I can't really break away from entirely. And so, you know, most recently, it's transformed from being in operational roles myself as like a chief product officer, et cetera, into more helping early stage founders with their journey based on a lot of the kinds of principles and things like that I wish that I had known when I was getting started myself. And if, hey, I can help them to see around corners and help them be successful along the way, that's fantastic.
I love that. And I love how you're taking your time in the trenches and you're like, okay, I'm stepping back here. I don't need to be in the trenches. I'm going to pass on to the other people in the trenches, making sure that they know what's coming around that corner so that they don't have to worry too much. And that's a great role to take. But I want to know, like you say, you got started back in its heyday, like 98, were cutting your teeth. How did you come into that role? Like, how did you stumble into the Silicon Valley world?
Well, I was in Silicon Valley. You know, I graduated.
First step is
Berkeley. I graduated from UC Berkeley. It was kind of funny, you know, looking at it in retrospect. I majored in statistics, and back then, surprisingly, nobody even knew what to do with that degree. I mean, obviously now it's like well regarded and it's really valuable in these technology companies and things like that. But at the time, people were like, "What are you going to do, you know, with that degree?" And I think I just was sort of lucky, maybe, to have been in the right time in the right place to some extent. Like you said, stumbling through there is probably the right way of describing it. But I was, you know, the way that I found myself into it was one of the kinds of things you could do with a stats degree was help with kind of like financial analytics type things for Wall Street investor types, et cetera, right? And so I ended up finding myself at a company that just happened to have software embedded in it. And we were selling some of that software to those companies. And so I started out as a support analyst, just kind of answering, you know, questions from, you know, these quick, crazy Wall Street investors that were dropping a bunch of F-bombs, you know, with their, you know, really upset about why our numbers were 2 basis points off of Bloomberg and things like that. And I was trying to answer their questions. And as I was doing that, you know, I was also QAing the software. And as I was queuing that software, bug reports started to turn into feature requests, which started to turn into directional guidance for where the product could go and things like that. And then literally one day, somebody came over to my desk and they just said, hey, would you like a job in product management? And I was like, what's product management? I don't even know what that is, And so they described it to me, and I got involved in that. And this was during this window when so many companies were growing and a bunch of venture capital money was just kind of flying around. And so there were all these like really interesting companies getting started, getting founded, and I had a chance to work with a lot of those good ones, learn from some of the best of the best. I was at eBay from 2001 to 2005, and that was just a magical time to be there. The stock price was soaring during that window. We were, acquiring all these new customers as internet expansion was sort of like, taking place, et cetera. And I had an amazing team of people that I got to kind of like learn from. And so that kind of just led to one thing being the other. But that's essentially the story of how I got to what I'm doing today.
I love that. And what you're doing today is very interesting because it's not what most people would think you're doing, because you have a service-based business, but you deal with products for other companies.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird irony, when you think about it, because as an entrepreneur, I've founded my own company here along with my business partner, Rajesh Nerlikar. And between the two of us and then a number of other folks that we've brought on since then as well, we've been able to build a really successful boutique advisory practice that sort of coaches a lot of product executives. It coaches a lot of early stage entrepreneurs. It coaches a lot of, engineering teams and things like that across different technology companies. And what's interesting about that is that when you're running a services company, you do things so differently than you do with a product company. And I constantly find myself talking on the one hand with a client saying, you need to do these kinds of things, you need to do those types of things, this is what's going to make you successful. And then turning around to an internally focused meeting with my own team and saying, okay, scratch all that. Here's all the things that we're going to do instead. Here's how we need to do it, et cetera. And while there are some commonalities, the reality is what makes a successful services company like Prodify is very different than what makes a successful client of a company like Prodify, which would be like, a typical kind of like tech company, application company, something like that.
And why did you shift off? Why did you go from, working in the trenches to co-founding Prodify to helping these tech startups?
Yeah, it's a couple different things. I would say one of them is as you do the job more and more, you start to realize all the general principles and things like that that have made you successful along the way, right? And in doing that, I realized that I had as much interest in sharing a lot of those principles and sharing a lot of those kinds of frameworks and things along those lines with others as I did in applying them myself. And honestly, there's a level to which it can become almost like boring to do it again when you're kind of like, okay, I've worked for the fifth different, tech company, and I've basically taken the same kind of playbook and applied it myself in a couple different, situations. I was more interested at that time of refining that playbook and sharing it with others in such a way that could make them successful as well. So I really enjoyed the mentorship aspect of it. And then I started to realize that, I think as I just matured and become a little bit older in my, career, and, I've been doing product now for 25 years, that it was more interesting to me at this stage to try to pay it forward. I had these great mentors that I got to work with when I was younger in my own career, et cetera. And I learned so many things from them. And if there was a way that I could do something similar for the next generation of product people, that was something that was sort of like more compelling at this stage of my career than just kind of like giving it one more run myself as well.
I like that. I like that aspect because, yeah, you have your playbook. It's going to work when you go there. Now it's like, it works for me. Let's see if we can get it to work for others aspect and helping those people coming up, because when like the rising tide lifts all ships, you helping as many people as you can. If you could go back to your 10-year-old self, I love this question because it's so unique. What advice would you give yourself? Would you give yourself any warnings? Would you change anything you want that happened in your life?
It's a really interesting question, and I'll tell you where my mind immediately goes. I'm gonna try to see if there's some key message or takeaway that's derived in real time as we're going through here. So I think the story I would tell is I was a really shy kid at that age, and I really struggled to kind of fit in, I think, socially with a number of people, etc. And I felt like what I needed to do a certain kind of like image to others in order to kind of like fit in. And in what I did to make that happen was, say I liked, I don't know, I'm just going to make stuff up, bands that I didn't even like, or I said, things that I was interested in that I wasn't actually interested in. And, things like that to try to like kind of fit in some particular way or to be successful, I guess, in how you think about success as a 10-year-old. And unfortunately, that carries with it this great deal of inauthenticity, right? Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, you're not confident. You're not going to project that type of thing because you're not being yourself. And maybe the lesson that I would have learned from this and the thing that I would tell myself is that it would be far better to just be yourself, be confident in yourself, have that authentic version of yourself, et cetera, that matches with who you are. And you'll find your people, you'll find the group that is going to sort of like match with that really well. And you don't have to sort of like conform to this sort of set of standards that somebody else has kind of like randomly defined. And I guess, if I was going to maybe project that forward now to like, how does that lesson apply in like the business world, or if you're an entrepreneur, et cetera?
You're jumping the gun. I was going to ask that question.
Right. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Well, go ahead. Yeah.
No.
What?
How would you apply that to a business world sense?
Wow. Amazing question. Yeah. Fantastic. I would say that the same thing really applies when it comes to companies. I just talked about this difference between being a services company and a product company, for example. And if all you did was, as a services company, pay attention to what product companies did, or vice versa, you'd probably be taking a lot of the wrong kinds of lessons and trying to apply those, wondering why you're not fitting in, wondering why that's not, actually working for you as a business. And you got to do the things that are necessary for your business. You got to do those things that are going to make you successful, given the type of business that you're trying to be. Don't try to be something that you're not. There was this one time that I was getting coffee with somebody locally, and he was like a financial services person, like a financial services planner and stuff like that. And he was asking me, he's like, okay, so tell me all the tricks about being a product company or whatever. I'm like, why would you want to be a product company? Like, the thing that sets you apart from everybody else is the quality of the actual services and the relationships and things like that you can build with your clients, et cetera. Like, that's actually what makes you unique. What you should be asking is, how do you do a better job with those types of things that are specific to your particular business, given what you've chosen as your target market, given what you've chosen as the value proposition to your customers, and so on. And it's just going to be completely different for different kinds of, companies. And I think that that's one of the difficulties out there, is that people will try to read books, for example, and try to derive everything that they're supposed to get out of a book. And having been an author myself, there's this big dilemma, which is, on the one hand, you want to share with as broad of an audience as you can some principles that you've picked up. But on the other hand, you kind of know that the reality is that the way that they should be applying those principles might vary from one company to another. And so you don't want to have it be so generic, because then it can't be like applied directly within a given company. But you also don't want to have it be so narrow, because then 90% of the people who are reading your book, it doesn't really apply to them, right? And so a lot of this sort of advisory work and consulting work and things like that, we never felt like writing a book was going to interfere with that business, because we wanted to share some of these high-level principles, but then how you actually apply them is going to vary depending on the unique qualities of the business that is trying to apply them, And I think that maybe that's the lesson, to kind of go back to the story of the 10-year-old, right? Is like, don't try to be some generic version that somebody else has defined for you to be. Be successful at what you do. If you look at all the most disruptive companies, it wasn't because they followed all the trends that were out there. It's because they bucked the trends that were out there, right? And they sort of like set their own examples that now everybody else is trying to follow.
Oh, no. And it's true. Like, if we look at TikTok, how everybody, the short form video, Instagram took it, Facebook took it, all the YouTube is now trying to do that. It's like, it's disrupting the market in their own unique way. how do you go about helping someone become that kind of disruptor when someone comes to you with their product and they're like, we want, and it's a great product, it is going to disrupt, but they may be missing something. Like, how do you go about helping them?
Yeah, there's two things that I think get in the way when somebody's trying to be disruptive in a particular market. There's two reasons that they end up failing. I think one of them is they think a little bit too narrowly or kind of like more immediate term than they should. You got to think long term about what the 10x version of quality of this is going to look like for somebody else, right? I mean, you don't disrupt a market by doing something just kind of like very marginally better than everybody else. That'll make you successful. You have a little bit of differentiation in there. It'll help you to kind of like acquire a bit of a market, but that's not going to be disruptive, right? You gotta take some sort of like a bet on something long term that's going to be sort of like truly game changing if you can make it work. And usually it is a bet, because if it was easy and it didn't carry with it any risk, your competitors would have done it already, right? So I think that's item number one. And item number two is people make this mistake of thinking that they're going to disrupt the market sort of like more directly, when in reality it happens indirectly. Okay, nobody disrupts a market by by these sort of like direct means. What happens is you solve a customer problem so well, some sort of problem that customers care about so well, that it transforms their expectations. And it's those shifting expectations of customers that actually transforms the market, right? Like, I hear entrepreneurs say this kind of thing all the time, like, oh, we're going to, come into this space and we're going to completely change it and turn it upside down, or we're going to go make $3 billion or, whatever. And it's like, okay, that's great if those are sort of like the sort of side effects or the sort of like results of you making a really good investment. But don't think about it from your perspective as a business. All right. You're not going to get these kind of like results because you just want them. You're going to get them because they're the byproduct of you solving something for customers that's so valuable and so different for them that it's going to change their expectations forever. And now what happens is all of your competitors, the kind of like companies that have been out there trying to solve these problems previously themselves, are going to find themselves kind of behind the eight ball, because the customer's expectations have transformed underneath them because of what you've done, right? I mean, let's take the Uber versus taxi example, right? I mean, it's one that everybody's kind of like familiar with. Mm-hmm. We were all fine with taxis before Uber came along, right? It wasn't really a problem. And like, it was annoying. And, because you'd call them and they wouldn't show up at your house, and, the taxi cabs were dirty and, things like that. But it was just like, you just kind of expected it. It was just the nature of how that stuff went. And then Uber comes along and it's like, I can get it from my phone. I don't have to talk to some crazy dispatch person who I don't even know if they're taking notes on what I said. I can see whether the car is actually on the way. I can rate the driver, and so I get a better quality experience. I got a clean car. Like, it's infinitely better than what the taxi experience was. Now, what happened was Uber comes along, creates this experience that's disruptive in this way, right? Because they're using technology in a way that taxi cab companies could have done this the whole entire time themselves, right? They just never did because they didn't think it was worth the investment. They were spending money instead on stuff like, paying off politicians and things like that to try to maintain their market share, as opposed to actually solving problems for the customers. Now somebody else comes along, they disrupt the experience for the customers. Now your customer experience is sort of like, completely antiquated as a taxi cab company, because customers, it's the same exact experience as it's always been, but customers' expectations have now risen. And now you're realizing that you're like way behind, right? That you're no longer as good of a solution as you used to be, not because your solution has changed, but because you're sort of like in this changed environment, right? That's what disruption looks like. It's not that Uber just came along and became a better taxi cab company. It's they envisioned something far in the future that was going to be far superior. And in doing so, they solved a customer problem. They've had this kind of customer focus in such a way that everybody else just sort of like woke up one day and was like, oh crap, we're like, we're obsolete, right? Overnight.
We're 20 years before the dinosaurs got hit by the meteor.
Yeah, sure.
In your 25 years of doing product management and with Prodify, you probably have gotten thousands of memories of client wins and personal wins. Do you have one that you would like to share with us, so that like to see some of the wins that we could, some of our audience can look forward to when they jump into this space of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think that I'll focus on, with Prodify, having built a gold standard reputation. I think that there's something about that, especially in the early days. Some companies or some entrepreneurs try to focus a little bit too much on trying to be, they'll focus on their profitability, they'll focus on their ability to scale, they'll focus on, can I hire cheap, labor, things like that. And like, yes, eventually you do need to get to those kinds of like stages where you build up a business that allows you to then make margins because you're charging something over here, and the cost of the labor and the cost of goods sold and things like that ends up being lower, right? But in the earlier days, the most important part is making sure that you never lose demand, right? It's all about driving demand, driving desirability of your brand that you're establishing, et cetera. So one of the things that I did early on when I was advising a lot of different kinds of companies is I would fly out to clients. That wasn't the expectation for what I was supposed to do. I would, I could always meet with them over the phone or Zoom or something like that. And I would just intentionally go out there and fly out to meet them. I'd grab lunch with them. I'd start to build some personal relationships, et cetera. I'd reach out to them proactively, which was above and beyond what the nature of the consulting arrangements were and things like that we had, and so on. But what it did is it helped to build that kind of gold standard reputation of like, wow, if you're ever going to work with a product advisor, this is the guy you got to go talk to. Like, this is the guy who goes way above and beyond. I don't even know how I'd be able to get done the things that I get done without this relationship that I've sort of like, built. And then what happens is you start to establish yourself more and more. And then later you get into the stage of saying, okay, how do we make sure that we can actually do this at a scaled level, right? So do I need to hire another advisor as part of my firm? Do I need to hire another kind of consultant who can come in and make sure that, the margins and everything else kind of like makes sense? I mean, sure, yes, you eventually need to do that. But if I had kind of like jumped the gun and did that first and sacrificed the quality of that gold standard reputation, I wouldn't be still getting all the referrals that I'm getting today from all the former clients that I had these great relationships with that continue to kind of like send business in this direction.
I love that. And referral business is pretty much in a consulting world. Sorry if there's loud noises coming by every once in a while. I apologize. Wait, sorry, I'm just jumping into the question again. Referral business is something that is kind of like the mainstay in consulting business, because you can't really advertise in the normal sense like a product-based business can with being a consultant. And you mentioned the gold standard, flying out. What other pieces of advice would you have for someone jumping into the consulting world? How they can maybe do their own gold standard or stand out a bit?
Yeah. I mean, certainly in terms of, in terms of establishing that reputation, I think that you should look broadly about where that reputation lives. So is it just the clients that you've worked with who have that reputation? How is word of mouth actually spreading? So I'll give you an example. In the companies that we tend to work with, most of them are venture capital backed. So and each of those venture capitalists have multiple companies that are in their portfolio. So that creates an opportunity for us to work with a company, have a connection into the VC fund that's their investor. They get the good sort of word of mouth because of the quality of the work that we put in at the company level. Now, if we only work with companies and we don't even work with venture capitalists, that doesn't mean that we don't care about our reputation within venture capitalists. In fact, that probably matters more than anything else, because you do really good work with 2 or 3 different companies in their portfolio, and they say, hey, that's great. Can I point you to 10 other companies in my portfolio? Now we go meet them, but they have multiple investors as well that are outside of just that VC firm. So now you go meet the next VC firm, right? And then you meet their portfolio, et cetera. And so you start to realize that your reputation isn't just limited to the companies that you're working with or the customers that you have. There's an entire network that's out there where your reputation matters. So I would encourage any entrepreneur who's working on a consulting business to be thinking about how that word of mouth actually spreads and how they can establish a reputation, not just with the kinds of clients that they work with, but the referrers of those clients, right? And what's going to make them say, wow, this is the person that you really need to work with.
So my question now, you mentioned earlier, being a disruptor, you have to take that bet that's going to be long term. what's the long term for Ben? What is Ben's 10-year mission, let's say?
Really, at this stage in my career, I'm mostly interested in just sharing a lot of the principles and best practices that I think have made a lot of these very successful technology companies successful, and averting the mistakes that some of the unsuccessful ones make. I mean, for every one you hear about, there's 9 that failed, right? And so separating those things out and saying, here's the kinds of things that drive success, here are the kinds of things that interfere with success, here's how it changes over different stages and so on. To the extent that I'm able to package that up, like we try to do when we wrote Build What Matters, we can package that up and we can share it with the kinds of companies that we're trying to serve. Then I feel like we're successful in sharing those practices so that the next generation of product managers can be successful as well. And the interesting thing about product management as a discipline is that nobody really learns it in school. Like nobody majors in product management, and yet it's one of the most valuable and important functions in any given technology company. So how do people kind of arrive there? How do they learn their skill sets if they're not, learning it while they're in a university or something like that, right? And the reality is they're learning it through apprenticeship. They're learning it because somebody else has been there and done this for a long time. They kind of take them under their wing, show them the ropes, answer their questions, correct their mistakes, and so on, until they become so strong at it that they can then mentor that next generation themselves. And really, that's kind of like the place that we like to play. And if I can, retire in 10 years or 20 years or whatever it is and say, here's this list of hundreds of people that I've had this kind of influence on, to me, that's success.
Oh, I like that. I like that. I want to touch on your book because you did bring it up, Build What Matters. What was the biggest driving force behind writing this book?
Mm-hmm. Well, we were working with a lot of different companies as advisors, as consultants, and we were having great conversations with them in depth about, how some of the concepts, the things that we've learned along the way apply in their particular business. But we were always constrained by the number of hours that we had in a day to actually work directly with those clients one-on-one. And so what we realized is that we wanted to share it with a broader base. I don't care necessarily about just having impact, here and there. I want to try to have that influence more broadly as well. And that was kind of like the reason that we embarked on the project of authoring this book in the first place, was just to have a broader cast net in terms of our ability to have that kind of positive influence within the space. But as we were writing it, I think a second thing emerged, which was that it made us a lot better at what we do as well. We'd of course always been giving advice and things like that along the ways. But when you have to put it down and you're writing it in a book, you can't have any holes in it, right? Like it has to be very, very airtight. And as you're putting it together, you realize, hey, wait, I've got to, explain the narrative of how I get from step 1 to step 2, from step 2 to step 3. And if there's something that's like not even like perfect there, then I've got to explain it in a better way. And it made me learn my own stuff better by trying to teach it. How it's kind of like you learn best by attempting to teach.
Yeah.
Really, that was sort of like the experience, I think, of writing a book. And when I look at it in retrospect, I thought that I knew a lot more than I did when I started writing the book. And I realize now how little I actually knew at the time that I started writing the book and how much more I know post writing the book. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
No, it does. It's like that saying when you have the 3 experts, someone who's just starting thinks they know everything, whereas someone who's been in the game for years doubts their knowledge and knows they don't have that much. So I like that. And it's like what you said with writing the book. You realized I may know a little bit. I don't know everything.
I've always compared it to like, you wake up from this dream and you try to tell your significant other about it or something like that right in the morning. And in your head, you're like, oh, it totally makes sense. I'm going to describe the whole thing. And it's only as you start describing it that you're like, whoa, wait, like, I don't know how I got from here to here, but never mind that. And then you try to keep going on with the story. Well, the problem is you can't say never mind that when you're writing a book, right? Like you're forced into making the narrative really make sense. And so that kind of forced our hand to have to think harder about some of the things that we hadn't thought about nearly as well. And I feel much better about our approach at this point.
I love that. Ben, we are coming to the end of the episode. I hate this because I'm having such a great time talking with you about your journey and Prodify, but I'm going to jump off stage here. I want to let you have the last little bit. Tell my audience where they can find you, how they can get in contact with you, if they're a tech company looking for some advice for their products and that. So the floor, sir, is yours.
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate it. So 2 different places I would point you to. Number 1 is our website, which is prodify.group. That's PRODIFY.group, GROUP. And then the other place is just on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. I'm posting things constantly. I'm looking at my messages constantly. Reach out to me. Tell me you had a chance to find me on this podcast. And my handle is just Ben Foster. Really easy. So you can kind of like find me there as well. But I always love to chat with people who are in the space, learn a little bit about what the kinds of things that they're working on, discover whether there's some sort of way in which we can help each other and so on. But those connections really mean a lot to me. And it's one of the best parts about working in the tech space is meeting all these amazing kind of like entrepreneurs and people trying to create new ideas, new kinds of products.
Awesome. Ben, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and sharing your story and talking to us about all the stuff you've done with Prodify and your advice and your knowledge.
Well, thanks, Phil. I appreciate it. Really great podcast, and it's great to be on.
Thank you. To my audience, as you know, in the show notes, you'll have all the links to connect with Ben and Prodify, and I highly suggest you do it. His LinkedIn is on point. But I thank you very much for listening, and remember to always invest in yourself.